3. As everywhere in classical philosophy, it would be a mistake to think that these discussions are no more than the problems of intellectuals and the squabbles of pedants. This can be seen most clearly if we turn back a page in the growth of this problem and examine at its stage in its development, when it had been less worked over intellectually, when it was closer to its social background and accordingly more concrete. Plekhanov strongly emphasizes the intellectual barrier that the bourgeois materialism of the 18th century came up against, and he puts it into perspective by means of the following antinomy. On the one hand, man appears as a product of his social milieu, whereas on the other hand, the social milieu is produced by public opinion, that is, by man. This throws light on the social reality underlying the antinomy which we encountered in the seemingly pure epistemological problem of production, in the systematic question of the subject of an action, of the creator of a unified reality. Plekhanov's account shows no less clearly that the duality of the contemplative and the individual practical principles which we saw as the first achievement, and as the starting point for the later development of classical philosophy, leads towards this antinomy. However, the naiver and more primitive analysis of Holbach and Helvetius permits a clearer insight into the life that forms the true basis of this antinomy. We observe firstly that following on the development of bourgeois society, all social problems cease to transcend man and appear as the products of human activity in contrast to the view of society held by the Middle Ages and the early modern period, for instance, Luther. Secondly, it becomes evident that the man who now emerges must be the individual, egoistic bourgeois, isolated artificially by capitalism, and that his consciousness, the source of his activity and knowledge, is an individual, isolated consciousness a la Robinson Crusoe. But thirdly, it is this that robs social action of its character as action. At first, this looks like the after effects of the sensualist epistemology of the French materialists, and Locke, etc., where it is the case, on the one hand, that his brain is nothing but wax to receive the imprint of every impression made on it, Holbach according to Plekhanov, opsit, and where, on the other hand, only conscious action can count as activity. But examined more closely, this turns out to be the simple effect of the situation of bourgeois man in the capitalist production process. We have already described the characteristic features of the situation several times. Man in capitalist society confronts a reality made by himself as a class, which appears to him to be a natural phenomenon alien to himself. He is wholly at the mercy of its laws. His activity is confined to the exploitation of the inexorable fulfillment of certain individual laws for his own egoistic interests. But even while acting, he remains, in the nature of the case, the object and not the subject of events. The field of his activity thus becomes wholly internalized. It consists on the one hand of the awareness of the laws which he uses, and on the other, of his awareness of his inner reactions to the course taken by events. This situation generates very important and unavoidable problem complexes and conceptual ambivalences, which are decisive for the way in which bourgeois man understands himself in his relation to the world. Thus, the word nature becomes highly ambiguous. We have already drawn attention to the idea, formulated most lucidly by Kant but essentially unchanged since Kepler and Galileo, of nature as the aggregate of systems of the laws governing what happens. Parallel to this conception, whose development out of the economic structures of capitalism has been shown repeatedly, there is another conception of nature, a value concept, wholly different from the first one and embracing a wholly different cluster of meanings. A glance at the history of natural law shows the extent to which these two conceptions have become inextricably interwoven with each other. For here we can see that nature has been heavily marked by the revolutionary struggle of the bourgeoisie. The ordered, calculable, formal, and abstract character of the approaching bourgeois society appears natural by the side of the artifice, the caprice, and the disorder of feudalism and absolutism. At the same time, if one thinks of Rousseau, there are echoes of a quite different meaning, wholly incompatible with this one. It concentrates increasingly on the feeling that social institutions, reification, strip man of his human essence, and that the more culture and civilization, that is, capitalism and reification, take possession of him, the less able he is to be a human being. And with the reversal of meanings that never becomes apparent, nature becomes the repository of all these inner tendencies opposing the growth of mechanization, dehumanization, and reification. Nature thereby acquires the meaning of what has grown organically, what was not created by man, in contrast to the artificial structures of human civilization. But at the same time, it can be understood as that aspect of human inwardness which has remained neutral, or at least tends or longs to become natural once more. They are what we were, says Schiller of the Forms of Nature. They are what we once were, says Schiller of the Forms of Nature. They are what we should once more become. But here, unexpectedly and indissolubly bound up with the other meanings, we discover a third conception of nature, one in which we can clearly discern the ideal and the tendency to overcome the problems of a reified existence. Nature here refers to authentic humanity, the true essence of man liberated from the false mechanizing forms of society. Man is a perfected whole who has inwardly overcome, or is in the process of becoming, the dichotomies of theory and practice, reason and the senses, form and content. Man whose tendency to create his own forms does not imply an abstract rationalism which ignores concrete content. Man for whom freedom and necessity are identical.